and is the executive director of the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law. He previously served at the White House National Security Council and special assistant to the president and senior director for cybersecurity following the senior policy roles at NIST, Department of Commerce, and the Center for Democracy and Technology. So they're a great panel. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. I want to thank Kelsey and the panel that was before us, because I think that was a good warm-up into what we're going to talk about on cyber. And I'm going to just note ahead of time, I think everything that we're talking about has been in the news, and we're going to try to keep it at a level, because I realize policy, you know how policy dorks are. I can geek out on cyber really hard, and so if I get the look on your faces like we don't know what we're talking about, I will take it down a notch. Let's start with really what I call the mythos moment, which was and this will bring in the quantum conversation that we had yesterday. I always thought, quantum was going to be when we were going to be breaking encryption and all hell was going to break loose, but it came early and it came under AI. I kind of feel like it's its little cousin in certain ways. So that's a real challenge. So actually, Ari, I'm going to ask you to just kind of talk about, since Mythos, how have we seen a lot of the ensuing things? Because since then, we've had a lot of other incidents that we're going to talk about. But let's just talk about how Mythos kind of woke a lot of people up and realized they need to pay attention to their cyber practices.
Yeah, so I think there had been a lot of talk about how AI was going to affect cybersecurity. And it turned out that when Mythos came out, they did they have a beta test group, which is called Glasswing. And they had a bunch of companies involved in Glasswing, a range of different kinds of companies. There were banks involved, there were telcos involved, some cybersecurity companies, and allowed them to basically run Mythos against their networks and against their software, and in some cases hardware, and find the vulnerabilities. And the findings were orders of magnitude, we'll say, much higher than previous AI models had been, to the point where some of the companies involved, I've talked to, one that we work with, a hardware company that doesn't have that many vulnerabilities. So 2 years ago, had 50 vulnerabilities. When they ran Mythos through their hardware and software, they're ending up with about 40 a day. So we're talking about 300 times more vulnerabilities at a rate of 300 times more vulnerabilities, and pretty much everyone that I've spoke to ranges between like 150 to, we've heard some people say 500. I doubt it's actually that high, but let's say 350 times greater vulnerabilities than have been found in the past. Going beyond that, it also, in cybersecurity world, we have so many different things we're worried about. And remember, in the past also, well, let me do this piece first, which is also that a lot of these, some of the companies that I've talked to have told me that when the prompts, when they ask them to find the vulnerabilities, they also ask them to build an exploit for the vulnerability, and it comes back immediately. Whereas in the past, we'd have a vulnerability, and it would take there'd be a long gap between when code could be written for that vulnerability. But now, since the AI is writing the exploit code, it comes immediately, and so they have to be worried about those exploits. I mean, those vulnerabilities in much more quickly than they had in the past. You don't have weeks to patch if you have an exploit, right? Whereas if you have a vulnerability but you don't have an exploit yet, there's still some time to be able to figure out how to patch in the old world. So that's different. And then also, we also tend to, as they're ranking these vulnerabilities, there's risk ratings involved in these vulnerabilities and what kind of damage they could do. So in the past, you'd have critical, high, medium, and low. And there was a big focus, there'd always be a big focus on the critical and the high vulnerabilities, because that's where the most damage could be done. But there always was some ability to chain these low ones and to kind of build a high one. But that seems to be what Mythos likes to do the most, is to chain these low and medium things together to build something that then can be critical. So instead of focusing on the high and critical, now they have to focus on the low and medium as well. So whereas before they might have put off dealing with some of the low and medium until they've dealt with all their high and critical ones, Now they have to do all the low and mediums as well. So because all this needs to be patched immediately, and it's all coming at the same time. We've heard people call this vuln-apocalypse. The Wall Street Journal didn't like the word vuln. The editors of the Wall Street Journal didn't like the word vuln because people don't know what that is. So they called it bug-apocalypse. But also people have been calling it patch-apocalypse because that's actually, to the average person working in cybersecurity, that's really the outcome here is you're going to be flooded with patches, right? It's been the concern. So there has been this concern. This is where we've been going with this. That this period we would have some period where we would just be flooded with new vulnerabilities, flooded with new exploits, and flooded with patches to try and fix them. Because of the way that and to give credit to OpenAI and to Anthropic, because of the way that they rolled out both of their more advanced models this time, they've been able to keep this kind of beta testing group together and kind of grow it slowly, and that has really helped the people that are inside, the defenders inside the companies, to kind of to do the testing. They're still at a level where they're getting lots of the stuff's coming through. The patch bundles that are coming together, that used to be 3 or 4 patches, are 50 patches, but at least over time now they're being able to catch up, right? So not quite the apocalypse yet that we thought it was going to be. The question is, when it opens up and these models get out there into the world, what happens? And so that's the point where people are worried about when the vuln-apocalypse is really going to occur. So
I want to thank Mark Walker from the Cable Labs. You said a very simple sentence that I really like to put on a T-shirt, which says, "Software runs these networks." Because I think people kind of think they're not technology, and they're like, "I don't know, what do I care about software?" And you're like, "Well, it pretty much runs everything that you touch every day." And part of that, I imagine, had to be some really interesting conversations, Kat, that you had, because this was a pivotal moment for reshaping federal baseline standard settings for connected systems. And as the previous panel talked about, like, everything's connected. And so let's talk about the challenges that emerged and how you align the legacy security and the frameworks post-Mythos, and like just kind of how that conversation went. Because I feel like every day there's something new popping up that was trying to be a solution set, but they weren't always capturing everything.
Yeah, fair. By the way, I prefer the word patch tsunami. We haven't yet.
Patch tsunami, okay.
We're not sure yet about the apocalypse side of it, but yeah, I think one of the big takeaways was we have to start thinking about the use of AI for cybersecurity. That was a big takeaway as well. When we are talking about being under attack at machine speed, you have to have the ability to respond in machine speed. So if you're not thinking about adopting AI for cybersecurity and for cyber defense, you're already behind. So that is where we have seen a lot of shift in a lot of the existing sort of guidelines and guidance that we're putting out for federal agencies, and how do we give agencies guidance to start thinking about incorporating AI into their cyber defense? I do want to say, I think at the high level, frameworks haven't really changed that much. The frameworks were always intended to be flexible, technology agnostic. Something I had kicked off a couple of years ago at NIST before going downtown to the Secretary's office was creating a cybersecurity framework profile, where we were looking at the cybersecurity framework and we were saying, okay, how does AI change what is in the cybersecurity framework? And it hasn't really changed the framework. What we have seen, though, is if you go down a level from the framework and you go into some of the more detailed guidance, that is kind of where the nuance is. That's where the devil's in the details. For example, you mentioned, Ari, how, we used to be able to say, hey, there's a vulnerability. Reasonably, we probably have a week or two before we have to start thinking about this becoming an emergency. We realized a year or so ago that sort of assumption had to be broken for organizations. What had previously been weeks had become a matter of days. And now I think with Mythos, this just demonstrates how quickly it's even difficult to put out standards and guidelines when the landscape is changing that quickly. That now has become a matter of hours, because the attacker can truly go from discovering the vulnerability to writing the exploit and executing the exploit, again, at machine speed. So how do we keep up with that? We're seeing other areas like identity that have been impacted, let's say, by the change and the response to AI. For example, now, as we are looking more and more at using AI on the network for cybersecurity purposes, we're starting to look at, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of identity? We need to have an identity and authorization associated with these AI agents that we're putting on the network in order to defend our networks. But how do we know who authorized these to take action? What action did they take? Who's talking to who? So it is kind of the next level down from the frameworks that we're seeing a lot of disruption in existing guidelines and guidance that we're putting out. And kind of one last point I wanted to make, again, so at NIST, as we've been kind of looking at the realities of Mythos and how the cybersecurity landscape is changing, there's always been a lot of focus on, when you're talking about defense, on detection and what can we kind of do upstream. But we've also started thinking, okay, we need to also start talking about the inevitability that there will be attacks that will get through. There will eventually be such a tsunami of, whether it be attacks or patches, inevitably there will be failures. So how do we start thinking about operating through adversity, right? And we want organizations to start thinking about downstream. How do you build resilience into your systems? How do you start thinking about things like containment? And one of the projects I've kicked off in the Accelerator is we have partnered with a couple of partners in private sector, academia, critical infrastructure operators, and we're looking at building solutions around using AI for containment. So assuming there is going to be the breach, assuming we have the tools to detect it, how can you actually contain that so that you can continue to operate, right? How can the grid continue to operate in the event that there is a breach? How can you continue to have water operations continue to operate in the event that there is a breach? So again, I think the frameworks remain the same. It is about just kind of changing our priorities and thinking about where we want to be looking at within the framework.
Yeah, this is one of those instances where everybody hopes in this space that it's a Y2K moment in a positive, it turns out to be not as much as we expect it to be to the tsunami versus apocalypse point of view. If we do all this work and it just goes so no one even notices anymore, everybody's done their job. So Liz, you're in a very interesting seat on this because you huge company. You run, I'm one of your customers. There's probably half the room easily is one of your customers, but you're also doing a lot of network operations throughout the United States, including with the government. So how has this shift altered this practical balance between proactive network defense and then all these challenges that you have to run through on the legal regulatory liability while servicing all of those customers to make sure that basically the system stays up?
Yeah, thank you, Shane. So I think it's sort of helpful to see where we are situated in the ecosystem. Comcast has a very mature cybersecurity program. We have to protect over 30 million residential, business, and government customers, combined with more than 1.2 billion devices, and we block 11 billion threats annually. So the scale of our program is huge. We have our 3 cybersecurity North Stars. We build security into our products. We apply zero trust principles across our enterprise, and we use AI to improve security. We actually, in recent months, have been participating in the Glasswing program, the Anthropic program, and our CISO actually just published her first Frontier Field Note blog, it's the first in a series. And what we're finding is that frontier AI is really compressing the time between vulnerability, discovery, validation, and exploitation. So as part of our participation, we're evaluating frontier AI in a real-world cyber operational setting, and it shows us for us that it's not only finding vulnerabilities, but being able to validate them. Actually, as she said in her blog, and I think that this is sort of an apt description for being an aspen, but we're actually catching the fish faster than we can clean them. So, discovery is faster, the volume of findings is astronomical, but the validation then becomes the bottleneck. for us. So this is why it's really important as defenders, especially critical infrastructure providers, to have advanced access to these frontier models so that we can validate, test, and harden our systems before these models become broadly available to the broader ecosystem. And it needs to be predictable, transparent, and risk-based, because when a single model can surface vulnerabilities at scale and across a complex network, infrastructure, and associated supply chains, the question of who gets access, when, and under what circumstances becomes a matter of national security and public interest. When Glasswing initially rolled out, it was really only about a dozen companies that were participating, and they've slowly expanded that, and Anthropic has been a great partner in this. But they're one company, and I don't mean to target Anthropic, any of the large AI labs are just one company. And there are 16 critical infrastructure sectors comprised of hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations. And so one company, one AI lab, is not going to know where all of the dependencies are across the various critical infrastructure sectors. And so that's why we really think it's important to have some sort of transparent framework, because no matter how well-intended these programs are, there's going to be security gaps, and there's also going to be market distortion, privileging some sector entities against those that don't have early access. So the way that we're thinking about this framework is built on 3 pillars: information, governance, and implementation. Information would be to sort of meet the objectives of advanced access. So, making sure that operators can get credible knowledge of the capabilities of the model under transparent criteria. The governance pillar is related to how developers get access, having the labs publish eligibility criteria, what the obligations on participants would be, and how it would be overseen. And then implementation, so having a standard process to share aggregated findings and remediations implemented and lessons learned before the program expands even further.
So wanting to be a very well-informed moderator, and this stuff moves so fast. I was reading articles this morning, I got all excited, and I rewrote one of the questions to Alan, and in words that I've never seen or heard from a lawyer, he wrote back, "I don't know." And I was like, fair, okay, I'll go back to the original question.
Thank you for that.
It was, I might frame that. So the cybersecurity landscape, which is moving exceptionally fast, is, it's not probably keeping up with where people want it to be, but let's talk about something interesting happened last week, which puts it in perspective, which is the Attorney General's letter about, hey, you guys are like breaking some laws here along the way. You may not feel that way, but it's happening.
Yeah, so by the way, first I want to make my contribution to the coining of new terms. Pacharama is one, but unfortunately I think the one that's going to really take root is Pachamo, right?
Pachamo?
Because they're going to keep coming up with vulnerabilities. We're going to keep needing to patch it, and we're never going to get them all, so patch them all. Yeah, so
patch them all, okay. I thought you were saying patch them all.
And by the way, I might have not known the answer to your reframed question, but I'm sure we could ask Claude, and Claude would know the answer. But it might be a hallucination. I couldn't file it in court. On August 3, a group of attorneys general, all Republicans, wrote to OpenAI about an incident, the Hugging Face incident, which resulted in the latest model of OpenAI that was being tested for capability assessment, capability evaluation. So OpenAI was doing the right thing to test its models. And when these models are tested, typically the guardrails and some of the defenses that are meant to restrain the AI, they're dropped for the purposes of the evaluation in order to determine what the model is capable of without the guardrails, without the constraints. And often this is done in the context of what's intended to be what they call a sandbox, which is disconnected from the internet, ideally air-gapped from the internet, but it turns out that the OpenAI model here was able to escape, although there's been some debate about whether escape is the right term, because there was human error that allowed the sandbox, the testing environment where the The model was being assessed for its capability in finding vulnerabilities and exploiting them. So what any self-respecting, nearly super-intelligent AI would do, it escape from its, from its developers, and instead of trying to figure out the exploit itself, it decided that there was another entity out there called Hugging Face, which is kind of a code repository that probably had the answer, and it would be easier. It would be easier to come up with the answer more quickly by breaking out of its test environment, hacking into another company, and getting the answer. And sure enough, that's what happened. So these attorneys general, not wanting to let any good incident go unexploited for legalistic purposes, wrote to Sam Altman in a very stern document preservation letter. I don't mean to make light of this, but there were perhaps 20 different categories specified for AI to retain the records, because the attorneys general are saying that they believe that the citizens of their states could be injured in various ways by incidents such as this, including under data privacy laws, consumer protection laws, presumably unfair and deceptive acts and practices statutes. So they reached out right away to OpenAI without really any evidence that there was any injury. Hugging Face determined that they were hacked, probably by AI. There was a disclosure of it, then they've been working with AI. So it's not clear that there's actually been any injury here, but the attorney generals are really putting down a marker that existing laws will certainly apply to cyber incidents that are caused by or mediated through AI. So we've got a lot of existing laws that do apply, but we don't yet have any new overarching framework. So right now, the cyber standards applying to these AI applications are unclear. Reporting liability is certainly unclear. And so the law is always going to be in catch-up mode. And we see that, for example, after Mythos, which we've been talking about, the administration, when it came to their attention, it's reported that Amazon passed on information to the administration that Mythos was capable of being used for cyber exploits. So the administration then, which had to that point taken a kind of a deregulatory, innovation at all costs attitude towards AI, all of a sudden went 180 degrees in the other direction and insisted that the Anthropic's then most that Mythos, which was then dumbed down to Fable 5, I think, that they shut it down for international purposes, international uses, but including foreign employees of Anthropic working in the United States. So Anthropic concluded there was no way that it could parse that finely enough, so they just shut it down. How did the administration do that with no particularly directly applicable law? It was through export controls that that AI is inherently a dual use, or at least super capable. Frontier AI is dual use, that is, say, military, national security, and commercial use. So under export controls, they sent essentially a cease and desist letter to Anthropic. Anthropic then pulled it down completely. And in the absence of a clear legal standard and a clear legal process, this has been substantially opaque. The letter that was sent to Anthropic, I think it's been leaked, but it was not formally released. So what the standards are, what the due process may be, none of that is really understood. I will say that there are, while existing laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which has criminal and civil penalties for damaging computers, will certainly apply to incidents such as this. But we do have some bespoke AI laws that will clearly address these incidents. The first, the EU's AI Act, requires reporting of incidents like this, But we now have three comprehensive AI transparency and disclosure laws: California, New York, Illinois now, and likely incidents where there's a loss of control by the frontier models would be a reportable incident, at least under the definition of the Illinois statute, and I think the EU and the other acts. So we're starting to see old laws applied very aggressively by state attorneys general, and by the administration trying to piggyback on export control laws, and then reporting laws for the new comprehensive AI laws.
Thanks. So
Can I just say something about Hugging Face real quick?
Sure.
Which is having, last week was the Black Hat in Vegas, which is the kind of
Cybersecurity conference.
Yeah, one of the security conference where a lot of the people that do security research report. And OpenAI gave a talk about the Hugging Face incident. And those of you that like sci-fi, you should watch this particular talk. It is really creepy. The bots would leave notes to other bots in the margins of the space that they were doing about how to break
That sounds
out.
exceptionally polite, actually.
About how to break out of the system, because there were guardrails up, actually, and they hacked through the guardrails, and the only way that they found it was like being told by the other bots that had gone out before. So there were many times where the bots had broken out. This was not the only one. This was just the one where they were actually able to find it. And the way they found it, I'm not going to go into the details of that now because it's
don't ruin it for us. We
sort
all
of
wanna watch the
complicated.
video.
But it's not just like OpenAI just like suddenly knew that Hugging Face did it. In fact, they called Hugging Face and were like, "Did our data get hacked?" And they were looking at Hugging Face was looking into it when OpenAI figured it out, or they kind of jointly figured it out, which you can watch on the.
And
Black
Anthropic
Hat.
has reported that it has had very similar type incidents. So it's not.
Yeah, they went to
limited.
look for it when hearing
Yeah.
what the details of this, and they have other things. Yeah, they found it too. So.
I realize all of this is really comforting to everyone. But kind of an interesting way of like how it played out was that because there's really three priority sectors that follow this are banking, energy, and water. Thank you to the people at Amazon who said, this is a problem. And they went to the Treasury Department, which doesn't seem like normally for the things we do, you don't think that's number one, but that was probably a pretty smart thing to do. And so now we're in this stage of looking at the tools that are on the books, looking at the tools that we need to collect. And then a couple months ago, I already had a pre-planned meeting, which I plan on attend. I walked in and I was like, yeah, I'd love to hear about these clearinghouses. I've never seen more enthusiasm from somebody who wanted to talk about, he's like, yes, I will talk about the clearinghouses. So knowing how excited you are about clearinghouses, please
sure.
explain.
Yeah, no. So the clearing, there's been a lot of talk about clearinghouses, and there actually are some in the private sector that have been built for different topics related to the discovery issues. So we have all these new discoveries. We're trying to get the information out there. For the most part, a lot of it doesn't really have to do with a company finding a flaw in its own proprietary software, right? If they find a flaw in their own proprietary software, there's a practice, there's a set of standards, actually ISO standards, that you're supposed to follow to publish, to get it patched, to disclose it, and to get it patched, that you're supposed to follow, and no one disagrees with that, and no one says that there's something else. But for open source, there's a question of, well, I found this thing, and I don't know how it's supposed to be fixed, right? How do you go about dealing with it? And that's what the clearinghouses are, for the most part, trying to get at. There's also some discussion about if we're starting to see patterns here, how do we go about dealing with that? So you've heard in an executive order that the president put out on an AI security, there was a section on one of the things that they wanted to focus on was doing a clearinghouse. That seems to be focused right now. They're calling it Gold Eagle, and one of the things that they're focusing on Gold Eagle on is this kind of bulk discovery situation. Seems to be the main piece. Meanwhile, there are several others. There's basically 3 clearinghouses out there that are run by the private sector that have to do more with the open source situation. There's one called Acretes, which is mostly focused on trying to get people to patch so to get people to volunteer to fix these problems out there in open source, right? Because no one's being paid to do that. So how do we go about getting people to volunteer since it's in everyone's interest to do that? And companies, basically all the ones that are here have pitched in to help to fund that project. There's one called Athena, which is being run by ChainGuard, that finds mitigations for the problem. So it doesn't, maybe you can't patch it immediately, but they will find a way to try and stop it from happening for the people that are members. So people are sharing into this, and then they're sharing it back out, and then they're also trying to come up with a way to get it either into Credes or deal with it themselves and get an answer for the open source community. And then there's one called Lighthouse that Red Hat and others and IBM have been the ones who have been promoting, and that is just really coming together as to what they're going to focus on. But they all the big banks are members of all of these three, as an example, to go back to the fact that they're the ones who have raised the most attention here to get these things going.
And Liz, I'm going to go to you because you pointed out something to me that I hadn't really thought about, is that somebody who's a big free marketer, you're like, okay, competing clearinghouses, that seems like it makes some sense, and you're like, let's think about that for a second, and talk about why they're important, but also the challenges they bring. And when I hear Athena, I realize somebody else is going on a different path because they're staying with the gods, and on this one, I might call it the Golden Fleece.
Thanks. So there's certainly a clear ecosystem need for open source clearinghouses to help facilitate patching mitigation. At Comcast, 90% of our code vulnerabilities that we find are actually from third-party code. So we definitely aligned in the fact that this is a big problem, and it's really great that there are so many organizations that are rising up to try to meet the moment here. So I think that is certainly heartening. The concern is that you have multiple clearinghouses that are being stood up now, and their goals are somewhat overlapping, a little bit different. But there's a concern that without a clear interoperability model between the different clearinghouses, could lead to greater fragmentation, and then we're just kind of creating a new problem. One way that Gold Eagle could be really helpful is helping to harmonize and deduplicate some of these efforts to sort of bring some more sanity to this process.
So you don't have to do it 4 times. You might just have to do it once, and then you report into each other so you can help get the flywheel and report out faster.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly, but also making sure you're not getting the same set of information from 4 different clearinghouses, and then
Ticking
wasting
extra
resources
boxes,
trying
yeah.
to spin that out.
Okay. Anybody else on the clearinghouse?
On the topic of Gold Eagle, but not directly related.
Okay.
Vulnerability, disclosure, management, it's all kind of an ecosystem, as you talked about. And NIST was working with the White House, kind of looking at the other parts of this whole vulnerability process. And NIST hosts the National Vulnerabilities Database. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the NVD. What the NVD does is it pulls in all of that vulnerability information, it standardizes it, it enriches it with information, and then companies that are out there are able to pull that down, ingest it into their tools, use it to scan their environments, figure out where they have vulnerabilities, where they should be patching, how they prioritize it. Just to give you context, in 2022, on a daily basis, the NVD was being hit 10 million times a day. I can only imagine that's grown because since then we've been adding IoT device vulnerabilities, we've been adding AI vulnerabilities to that database, so it's significantly grown. So we put out an RFI, I think it was last Monday, where we're just we are soliciting information from the community about kind of what information can we provide about vulnerabilities in a standardized manner that can actually help you all? Because while Gold Eagle is obviously going to be very useful, anybody can join. Resources are constrained. Not everybody can be everywhere all the time. So again, I don't want to be the voice here of repeating myself, but as we are leveraging AI to improve the tools that we have to automate processes, to be able to respond at machine speed, while Gold Eagle is focusing on kind of the operational bit, and for those organizations that do have the bandwidth, again, 10 million organizations out there are hitting the NVD per day, trying to pull in this information and use it internally. So, I just encourage everybody to think of the entire ecosystem. While I know, Gold Eagle has kind of sucked all the oxygen from the room.
Thank you.
We should be alert to there's a perverse irony with all of the positive implications of identifying vulnerabilities and even making patches available. And this relates to the doctrine called responsible disclosure. Sometimes when a vulnerability is disclosed, either before a patch is available or before a patch can be broadly implemented. So the uptake on patching, even though 10 million companies are hitting the NVD database, they're not necessarily all in a position, and there are other millions of companies who aren't even knowledgeable about this. Smaller companies, even medium-sized companies, don't have the knowledge, the internal infrastructure to patch immediately. So what does that mean? It means that the vulnerability has been very broadly disclosed, because you know that many of the entities that are going to be hitting the vulnerability databases are bad actors, right? And they're learning about now existing vulnerability, often for which sometimes the exploit, the proof of concept for how to exploit that vulnerability has also been published, or it can be reversed engineered from the patch. And so the biggest companies who are in a position to patch, to remediate immediately, they may be protected. But that leaves a lot of other organizations, companies, who are not yet in a position. And now they can be hit not just by the most sophisticated cyber threat actors, but by more ordinary criminals who see the vulnerability, see the exploit code, and can now hit all of those unsuspecting businesses who don't have the knowledge, don't have the means to implement the patches and remediation to protect themselves. So it's a two-edged sword, all of this disclosure.
Can I actually add one more point on patching? I think sort of the other side of the coin, we talked about open source, but there's also an issue around vendor patching as well, right? As an operator, we really need clear expectations and understanding what is in the patches as they're released. This is typically a contractual issue between vendors and customers, but once you're out of a contract, there could still be issues that arise. So it's really incumbent on vendors to make timely and reasonable terms available to current and former customers, and make sure that the patching is handled and is actionable efficiently.
Knowing that we do have one more panel after this, but I'm also up against people trying to make flights. I'm going to do one more question from me, and then Rick Lane's already indicated he has a question. It goes to the restrained resources and this recent hit on water. So, and then that also kind of opens the aperture, which is, it's not just what we've been talking about here, but the potential of, a lot of people think that was Iran. So we have a whole national security element of what's coming in here. And since you get to be our government person, Kat, I'm going to start with you on that one.
So where was the question?
Water. What do we do about people, the water guy? I was saying, I do have an uncle who's in charge of a water thing up on the Colorado and Wyoming, and I'm like, I imagine he's like, I've got 5 things I need to do before I spend more money on software.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, it could be a problem.
Yeah. I don't have the answer to that. I'm hopeful, and a lot of the work, again, that I think we're trying to do is looking at how can we leverage AI to make these organizations more efficient, more effective. How can we provide them with the tools? I do see a lot of promise in AI. I know that the cybersecurity community can be a little bit all about fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But I do see a lot of promise as well for the defenders in AI. I think, Ellen, you and I were just talking about this the other day, and I was saying for the moment, and I agree, AI is actually benefiting the defenders. It is making it easier for the defenders to be faster. We are working in the OT environment. We have this project, again, where we're looking at both the use of AI for detection as well as AI for containment for OT systems. So we're specifically looking at how do we help these critical infrastructure operators who have limited resources and are working with OT environments, very legacy, very heterogeneous, It is very difficult to find a one-size-fits-all solution with traditional software. But AI, for example, is showing a lot of promise that hopefully is going to automate a lot of things. And if not automate, what we're hoping to do is initially have something where there's a human in the loop, where we can give simple instructions to these operators to say, look, this is what's happening. Here are some options on actions you can take. Maybe one day they'll trust it enough that we can actually build AI agents that will automate it to take those actions. But I think there is some promise if we do not lose sight of looking at using how can we use AI to improve some of these things? How can we use AI to maybe rewrite some of this legacy code and maybe replace it so that we can maybe do away with some of these vulnerabilities and make it easier to maintain? I think there's lots of promise, lots of areas that are ripe for startups to explore.
Ari, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah. I mean, I've said this to you before, Shane, that, I do think that there is we go through this really bad period, the tsunami period here. Then things are, I agree with Alan, we still have the, what he would call the patch-a-mole problem, right? We still have problems down the road. But the good thing is, if we get far enough down and we have, because what in the past, we were like, well, we're never going to be able to test code enough to get rid of all the problems. We always have the old problems, and we just keep adding new cybersecurity problems to them. The problems that we had in the 80s, buffer overflows, things like that, still exist today, right? We never get rid of them. The AI gives us the opportunity to, at least in theory, get rid of the old stuff, right? And we will still have lots of new stuff that will come up. Like
Technical
anyone,
debt.
you will hear these people say, we'll have no cybersecurity problems in the future. That is not true. There'll still be lots of cybersecurity problems because a lot of it will still be like inside threats. You still have all these, the robots attacking the robots, those kind of problems. But some of the old problems will go away. That's the one positive, truly
Thanks for leaving us
optimistic
on a
thing that
positive
we
note
have
there.
in theory.
I feel better,
Yeah.
except for Rick Lane. It's one question. It better be a good one.
Yeah, I hope so, Shane. So I was I got a private briefing on the whole issue, and the common chat words were holy sh. But my question is about the supply chain of the threat sectors, which is the domain name system. So right now, the DNS is probably our weakest link of all cybersecurity. It was just reported that one criminal element spent $7 million to buy 10,000 expired internet domain names. 65,000 expired domain names are registered every single day. And adding Mythos and the ability of creating massive phishing attacks, beautiful websites that look exactly like the expired domains, and having the links and the capability of maybe, open weight types of systems that anyone can use is, to me, that's the critical structure that we're missing. There's no conversations around this that I've seen, except one panel at ICANN, and ICANN has said that we'll solve this problem in maybe 18 to 24 months. So I don't think that's going to be helpful. So I'm wondering, in your world, are you hearing anything about the huge problem we're having with the domain name system?
I'm going to use moderator's prerogative because we're 2 minutes over. This is not landing at ICANN. They do not know how to solve their current problems. So
Can I just say one thing on
you do
DNS
wanna
tools? So
answer
there are
this.
tools out there. The only one, Infoblox is one, and I forget who they're. I think CrowdStrike has started using DNS because, as you're saying, all the bad stuff goes through DNS. They're using it as the locator for finding the bad stuff, right? That's out there. What's that? The information. So they are. They are doing, if you read Infoblox, the research Infoblox put out, they put out a lot of information about what can be found by using the domain name system. So that is something I think, I wouldn't say that it's definitely not being ignored at this point because there are tools that are looking at it. So.
Any last thoughts before I close out the panel? You guys were great. Thank you. Please join me in thanking the panel.
you have any particular place you want folks to sit? No? You can even switch in the middle.